Before this place became his cage, it became his refuge. In the heart of Delhi stands Tihar Prison, a fortress of concrete meant to contain men the world has abandoned. For most, it is an ending. But for one man, it was the safest place on earth. Charles Sobhraj did not fear prison. He feared freedom. Because beyond these walls waited extradition, execution, and a rope in Bangkok. And so, while others counted days to release, he calculated how to stay inside. This is not the story of a man trying to escape prison. It is the story of a man who needed it to survive. Morning in Delhi always begins with a dull gray light, not a burst of brightness, but a slow seep, filtering through concrete walls and settling over the city like a thin veil of dust, smoke, and history. Hidden within that light, far from crowded boulevards and government buildings, stands Tihar Prison, a vast complex of concrete, steel, and discipline, built to contain those for whom society has run out of space. For most inmates, Tihar is the end of the road where every path closes and freedom becomes a distant, almost mythical memory. But for one man alone, Tihar meant something entirely different. It was not an ending. It was the safest place on earth. That man was Charles Sobhraj. When Charles Sobhraj first walked through the gates of Tihar in the mid-1970s, he did not carry the posture of a man about to be crushed by the Indian prison system. Instead, he moved with a calm that bordered on arrogance, the composure of someone who believed he understood the rules of the game better than anyone around him. Born in France, of mixed European and Asian heritage, Sobhraj grew up amid gaps in family, in law, in identity. From an early age, he learned a lesson that would shape his entire life: the world is not governed by morality, but by loopholes. And whoever finds them first, wins. In the years before his imprisonment in India, Sobhraj moved across Asia like a ghost, armed with false passports, false names, and endless false stories. In Bangkok, Kathmandu, Hong Kong, and Delhi, he appeared as a gem trader, a smuggler, a generous companion to young Western backpackers drifting along the so-called hippie trail. But behind the cultivated charm lay a cold sequence of crimes: drugging, fraud, strangulation, burning bodies, drowning victims in bathtubs. When bodies began surfacing on beaches and in cheap guest houses, Thai newspapers gave him a name that would follow him for the rest of his life: the Bikini Killer. Yet what sets this story apart from an ordinary criminal file is not the number of victims, nor even the brutality of the crimes. It lies in what happened next. When Charles Sobhraj was arrested and convicted in India for drugging French tourists, he began to see prison not as an enemy but as a tool. A tool for delay. A tool for survival. Inside Tihar, order was not maintained by batons and razor wire alone. It was sustained by informal arrangements, silent handshakes, and envelopes of cash that moved faster than official paperwork. Sobhraj recognized this immediately. Using gemstones hidden with precision and a network built over years of deception, he began buying influence one link at a time. Guards addressed him with respect. His meals were different. His clothes were tailored. At night, when steel doors slammed shut, he slept on soft pillows while other prisoners curled up on cold concrete floors. From the outside, this looked like moral decay within the prison system. From the inside, it was brutal logic. Tihar was overcrowded, underfunded, and overwhelmed. A prisoner who cooperated, who caused no trouble, was an asset. And Charles Sobhraj did more than cooperate. He positioned himself at the center of a fragile equilibrium, where everyone benefited if he remained comfortable behind bars. But there was one truth no bribe could erase: his Indian sentence was nearing its end. And for Charles Sobhraj, freedom did not mean escape. It meant death. In Thailand, murder cases were waiting. Western victims. Families who never received answers. And a legal system prepared to impose the death penalty. When the gates of Tihar opened, what awaited Sobhraj was not sunlight, but a one-way flight to Bangkok and an execution chamber. For the first time in his life, a man who survived by running realized that the safest place he could be was not outside prison but inside it. During long nights in Tihar, Charles Sobhraj began to calculate. Not a simple escape, but a legal paradox. Thai law imposed a statute of limitations on murder prosecutions. Time, stretched long enough, could reduce a death sentence to meaningless paper. What he needed was not to escape prison but to remain imprisoned longer. The problem was obvious. How do you force a country to keep you incarcerated when the law requires your release? That question, quietly formed between Tihar's concrete walls, would lead to a plan so counterintuitive that even seasoned figures of the criminal underworld would struggle to believe it. A plan in which escape was not meant to make him disappear but to bring him back. A chess match where the prison was no longer the opponent, but the most valuable piece on the board. And it was here, within the false stillness of India's most secure prison, that one of the strangest prison break plots in modern history began to take shape. Every night in Tihar, steel doors slammed shut like a verdict. Time stopped for thousands of inmates. But for Charles Sobhraj, time became a weapon. He studied the law the way others study escape routes, patiently, obsessively. Across borders, India moved slowly. Thailand moved brutally. France protected its own. Somewhere between these systems, he saw a gap wide enough to disappear into without ever leaving his cell. What followed was not desperation, but design. A plan so illogical it could only work once, and only if no one understood it until it was too late. When the steel doors of Tihar closed each night, the sound of metal echoed like a ritual, a reminder to every inmate that time no longer belonged to them. But for Charles Sobhraj, time was not something taken away. It was the only resource he still possessed, and he used it with the cold patience of a man who understood that if it could be stretched long enough, the law itself would begin to erode. Inside his cell, amid concrete walls soaked with sweat and history, he began turning the prison into a chessboard. Sobhraj's calculations were never impulsive. They were built on a deep understanding of three legal systems, operating simultaneously: India, Thailand, and France. In Thailand, capital punishment existed, but it was bound by statutes of limitation. In India, criminal procedure was notoriously slow, layered, and bureaucratic. And in France, the law strongly protected its citizens from extradition in many circumstances. If aligned correctly, these three systems could form an escape route without running at all. Sobhraj understood that he could not simply ask to remain imprisoned. No judge would keep a man behind bars because he feared extradition. The legal system does not operate on fear, it operates on charges. If he wanted to stay in Tihar, he needed more crimes. But not just any crimes. They had to be serious enough to trigger years of trials and appeals, yet not so severe as to provoke execution or uncontrollable international outrage. The balance was razor thin, but essential. It was within this logic that the idea of escape emerged, not as rebellion, but as legal theater. A standard prison break would not suffice. If Sobhraj vanished permanently, India would close its file and Thailand would step in. What he required was an escape loud enough to paralyze bureaucracy, yet designed to end with his recapture on Indian soil. To flee only to return. To generate chaos and then submit. This paradox could only exist in a system slow enough to absorb shock without collapsing. For months, Sobhraj observed guard rotations, eating habits, faces susceptible to bribery and those that were not. He never rushed. In Tihar, a single mistake could result in a bullet. But doing nothing guaranteed death in Bangkok. The choice, in his mind, was brutally clear. The first requirement was accomplices. No prison break of this scale could be executed alone, not inside India's most secure prison. Sobhraj needed men willing to risk everything. Not out of loyalty, but desperation. He found them among convicted drug traffickers serving life sentences. Men society had already written off, men with nothing left, but the fragile hope that life might still offer another turn. Sobhraj recruited them carefully, revealing the plan in fragments, like chapters of a novel. He spoke of Nepal, of mountain villages beyond the reach of Indian police. He spoke of new identities, new beginnings. What he did not say was the truth that freedom itself was the trap. The men believed they were escaping together. They did not know they were pawns. At the same time, Sobhraj began assembling the true weapon of the operation: chemistry. For years, he had perfected the use of sedatives to incapacitate victims without killing them. That expertise now became scientific. Drugs were smuggled into the prison through multiple channels, concealed in parcels, passed by corrupt guards, hidden in objects as mundane as books and food containers. At night, while Tahar drifted into its half-sleep, Sobhraj crushed tablets into powder, tested solubility, adjusted ratios. The mixture had to act fast, but not fatally. A dead guard would mean murder charges and international fury. Unconscious guards would mean assault, exactly the kind of mid-level charges that could clog Indian courts for years. Every detail mattered. Timing, dosage, effect. This was not recklessness. It was precision. As the plan took its final shape, one truth became undeniable: this was not an act of desperation. It was the culmination of a career built on manipulation. Charles Sobhraj was not trying to destroy the system. He was using it, stretching it, bending it, forcing it to serve him. Prison, law, police all became props in a performance designed to generate maximum legal friction. And as the chosen date approached, Tihar continued its routines, unaware that one of its inmates was preparing a spectacle that would draw the attention of an entire continent. The walls stood firm, silent, unchanged. But inside them, a plan far stranger than any conventional prison escape was waiting to be set in motion. On March 16, 1986, there were no alarms at Tihar. No riots. No gunfire. Just a birthday cake. 7 armed guards stepped into a prison cell to celebrate a man they trusted. Minutes later, all of them lay unconscious on the floor. No violence. No struggle. Just sweets, smiles, and silence. India's most secure prison had been neutralized without a single blow. But this was not a breakout driven by hunger for freedom. It was something far stranger, a performance designed to be seen, remembered, and reversed. March 16, 1986, did not appear on any official calendar of the Indian prison system as a day of consequence. There were no alerts, no warnings, no indications that the internal order of Tihar was about to be quietly dismantled. It was an ordinary afternoon, hot, dusty as late sunlight cut through the iron bars, casting broken bands of light across concrete floors worn smooth by decades of confinement. And it was precisely this ordinariness that made the plan possible. For years, Charles Sobhraj had cultivated the image of a model prisoner. He did not riot. He did not threaten. He did not challenge authority. Instead, he was courteous, controlled, even generous. Small gifts appeared at the right moments. Compliments were offered carefully. His presence became familiar, and familiarity, more than force, dulled vigilance. The idea of a birthday celebration inside India's most secure prison should have raised alarms. Under any other circumstances, it would have been rejected outright. But when it came from Sobhraj, a man guards trusted, a man woven into the prison's unofficial equilibrium, it passed without resistance. A small gathering. A cake. Some sweets. A gesture of gratitude. In a place as harsh as Tihar, moments like these were rare enough that people wanted to believe they were harmless. The birthday itself was not real. It was chosen for convenience, not meaning. What mattered was the opportunity. A celebration allowed food. Food allowed proximity. And proximity in this plan was everything. The sedatives had already been prepared. Tablets crushed into fine powder, blended into dense, sugary Indian sweets where butter, sugar, and spice erased any trace of bitterness. This was not a new technique. A decade earlier, Sobhraj had refined this method while drugging travelers across Southeast Asia. Now, it was applied with clinical accuracy. Dosage was calculated for adult male body weight. Onset time was timed to coincide with the evening shift change. That afternoon, the cell block looked subtly wrong. Paper streamers hung loosely. A bedsheet served as a makeshift banner. A vanilla cake rested on a metal stool beside plastic cups and a kettle of tea. It was absurd and therefore disarming. One by one, armed guards stepped into the cell. They did not see danger. They saw a familiar face. They accepted the invitation. They laughed. They took the sweets without hesitation. Prison food was monotonous, and quality dessert was a luxury few questioned. For the first moments, nothing happened. Conversation continued. Tea was poured. A joke landed and drew scattered laughter. Then, slowly, the first signs appeared subtle enough to be dismissed. A guard blinked too long. Another wiped sweat from his brow. A cup slipped from a hand and shattered on the floor. Within minutes, the collapse spread. A senior officer stopped mid-sentence, swayed, and slumped against the wall as if his strings had been cut. Two guards in the corridor rushed in to help, and fell within seconds themselves. The drugs had already entered their bloodstream. Less than 5 minutes after the first sweet was eaten, 7 armed officers lay unconscious on the concrete floor. Breathing. Alive. Exactly as planned. India's highest security prison had not been breached by violence, it had been neutralized by trust. Sobhraj did not celebrate. He moved with controlled urgency. He stepped over a convulsing body, unclipped the master key ring from a guard's belt, and silenced an accomplice's gasp with a single glance. There would be no triumph yet. Everything depended on the next 30 minutes. The unconscious guards were dragged into the cell. The steel door was locked. Prisoners had imprisoned their jailers. The reversal was almost poetic, but there was no time to linger on symbolism. The group moved down the corridor at a measured pace. Running would attract attention. Panic would invite gunfire. They walked like men on routine duty, nodding to a drowsy guard who barely looked up from his newspaper, passing an administrator buried in paperwork. The shift change was minutes away. At the final checkpoint, a guard sat behind reinforced glass, his hand near the emergency alarm. Sobhraj approached calmly, smiling. "Report to the superintendent's office," he said in fluent Hindi. The guard hesitated, sensing something wrong, but recognizing the familiar face. After a pause, the gate buzzer sounded. "Be right back," the guard called casually as the heavy steel door opened. It slammed shut behind them with the sound of a coffin closing. Outside the prison walls, evening air flooded their lungs for the first time in years. A white ambassador sedan waited exactly where promised. The engine turned over. Doors opened. The men piled in. As the car merged into traffic, Tihar remained silent behind them, unaware that its internal order had been suspended by nothing more than sweets and patience. The escape had succeeded. But this was not an ending. It was only the opening act of a far larger design, one in which freedom itself was an illusion, and capture was the true objective. By midnight, India was on lockdown. Airports sealed, borders watched, Interpol alerted. The most infamous killer in Asia had walked out of prison and vanished. Or so it seemed. While police searched mountains and borders, Charles Sobhraj headed somewhere no fugitive should ever go. Toward crowds. Toward tourists. Toward cameras. 3 weeks later, he was eating dinner at a seaside restaurant, reading a newspaper with his own face on the front page. He did not run when police arrived. He smiled and held out his wrists. Because being caught was the point. By the time night fell over Delhi on March 16, 1986, Tihar prison was still operating under the illusion of normalcy. Watchtowers stood quiet. Shift changes proceeded as scheduled. No alarms sounded. It would take hours before anyone realized that something fundamental had gone wrong. When a junior officer finally noticed that a cell door was locked from the outside, the discovery triggered a chain reaction. Sirens tore through the compound. Shouts echoed across the concrete corridors. 7 armed guards were found unconscious alive, but humiliated, confined inside a cell meant for 1 man. 6 prisoners were gone, and the name Charles Sobhraj moved instantly from internal reports to national emergency calls. India's response was swift, but chaotic. Roadblocks sprang up along highways leading out of Delhi. Airports were sealed. Train stations and ports were placed on alert. Bulletins were transmitted to state police forces across the country. Interpol issued a red notice. Within hours, the escape had transformed from a prison failure into an international incident. The headlines were unforgiving. The Bikini Killer walks out of India's most secure prison. Public outrage collided with a reluctant fascination. How could a facility designed to be impenetrable be undone not by weapons or riots, but by cake, sweets, and politeness? Investigators worked under immense pressure. Every rumor was pursued. Nepal was considered the most likely destination, with its porous borders and rugged terrain. Ports were monitored for stowaways. Private aircraft were scrutinized. Each reported sighting fed the urgency and the confusion. But while law enforcement looked outward, Charles Sobhraj moved in a direction no fugitive should. The car carrying the escapees headed south toward Goa. For the accomplices, the choice made no sense. Goa was crowded with foreign tourists, journalists, and police. It was visibility, not concealment. It was exposure, not refuge. But Sobhraj offered no explanation. He did not need to. Because disappearance had never been the plan. As days passed, the manhunt intensified. Police careers hung in the balance. Thailand demanded answers. Diplomatic messages crossed borders. The escape had become a matter of national prestige. And failure was no longer an option. Then came the report that cut through the noise. At a seaside restaurant in Goa, a foreign man matching Sobhraj's description was dining openly, no disguise, no urgency, no attempt to hide. In a week filled with false leads, this tip should have been dismissed. Instead, a local inspector followed instinct. Inside the restaurant, the scene defied expectation. Charles Sobhraj sat by a window. Sunlight touching his face, the same face now printed across newspaper front pages. He was reading calmly, eating curry. When the police entered, there was no flight, no resistance. He looked up, smiled, and extended his wrists before the handcuffs were even raised. The arrest stunned the nation a second time. Relief followed confusion. Why would a man capable of escaping Tihar choose to expose himself in a public tourist hub? Was there hidden money? A failed rendezvous? A psychological collapse? The answer emerged not in panic, but in calculation. During interrogation, Sobhraj explained his actions with the detached clarity of a chess player reviewing a completed match. He had never intended to live free. The escape was a performance engineered to generate the maximum possible legal consequences on Indian soil. By escaping, drugging government officials, evading capture for weeks, and then being rearrested, he had created new, serious charges. Crimes committed in India. Crimes requiring investigation, trial, appeal. Years of them. And while those years unfolded, Thailand could not touch him. Every day India held Charles Sobhraj was a day Thailand could not execute him. The realization landed heavily among investigators and prosecutors alike. This had not been a failure of enforcement. It had been an exploitation of procedure. Sobhraj had not run from prison. He had run from extradition. When he was returned to Tihar, it was not as a defeated fugitive, but as a man who had completed his objective. The prison gates closed once more. Court calendars filled. Paperwork accumulated. And somewhere beyond India's borders, the clock governing Thailand's murder prosecutions continued to tick relentlessly toward zero. When Charles Sobhraj returned to prison, the escape was over, but the strategy had just begun. New charges piled up. Trials stretched on. Appeals followed appeals. Court calendars filled, then overflowed. Each delay meant survival. Each year behind bars in India erased another year of Thailand's reach. Somewhere in the silence of paperwork and procedure, a death sentence quietly expired. No announcement. No justice served. Just time doing exactly what Sobhraj needed it to do. The law had not failed. It had simply run out of patience. When Charles Sobhraj was escorted back through the gates of Tihar prison, the atmosphere inside had shifted unmistakably. The familiarity was gone. The casual nods had vanished. Guards no longer saw him as a cooperative inmate, but as something far more unsettling: a man who had used the prison itself as a strategic shield. Immediately, the Indian legal system began doing what it was designed to do: move slowly. New charges were filed. Escape from lawful custody, drugging government officials, unlawful confinement of prison staff, endangering institutional security. Each charge alone carried weight. Together, they formed a legal burden too heavy to move quickly. Hearings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Witness lists grew. Internal investigations were launched, not only into Sobhraj's actions, but into how such an escape had been possible at all. Guards became witnesses. Administrators faced scrutiny. Questions of corruption, negligence, and systemic failure could not be avoided, and none of them could be resolved quickly. For Charles Sobhraj, this delay was not a side effect. It was the goal. While prosecutors assembled cases, Sobhraj returned to a familiar rhythm behind bars. He exercised. He read. He spoke to journalists with measured confidence, careful never to admit guilt for murder, careful always to frame himself as a master of systems rather than a violator of lives. Every interview reinforced his myth and quietly extended the timeline. Outside India, the pressure mounted. In Thailand, prosecutors watched the calendar with growing frustration. The murders attributed to Sobhraj dated back to the mid-1970s. Under Thai law at the time, even the gravest crimes were subject to statutes of limitation. Each month Sobhraj remained in Indian custody reduced their ability to act. Extradition requests were drafted, revised, delayed. Diplomatic communications grew tense. But as long as India was actively prosecuting new crimes committed on its own soil, Thai authorities could do nothing. Legal procedure trumped moral urgency. Years passed. What had once been an international manhunt gradually transformed into a procedural stalemate. Sobhraj's name faded from daily headlines and reappeared instead in court schedules and legal journals. His case became a reference point not only for criminal behavior, but for institutional vulnerability. By the mid-1990s, the outcome became unavoidable. The statute of limitations on Thailand's earliest murder cases expired. One by one, the files lost their legal force. The death penalty that once loomed so close dissolved into administrative silence. No public announcement marked the moment. No press conference declared defeat. But the battle was over. Time had done what no lawyer could. In India, sentencing continued. Sobhraj received additional prison terms that extended his incarceration into the late 1990s. For any other inmate, this would have been devastating. For Sobhraj, it was confirmation. Each added year meant survival. When Charles Sobhraj finally walked out of Tihar in 1997, he did so not as a fugitive spared by luck, but as a man who had completed a long legal strategy. At 52, he was free in the only sense that mattered to him beyond execution. He boarded a plane to Paris. Cameras flashed. Journalists gathered. In France, he was a citizen protected by laws that severely restricted extradition for crimes long past their prosecutable limits. Publishers approached him. Filmmakers expressed interest. His story shifted from criminal dossier to cultural phenomenon. Yet beneath the surface of that apparent victory lay a quieter truth. Sobhraj had not defeated justice. He had delayed it until it no longer functioned. The system had not absolved him. It had simply run out of time. And as history would soon demonstrate, Charles Sobhraj had not learned when to stop playing. In 1997, Charles Sobhraj walked free not because he was innocent, but because the clock had beaten the gallows. Back in Europe, he became a curiosity. A legend. A man who had outwitted nations. Then, without necessity, without pressure, he made a choice no strategist should ever make. He went to Nepal. A country with no statute of limitations. A place where memory still mattered. There would be no loopholes this time. No delay. No escape. Just a courtroom and a verdict waiting patiently for decades. When Charles Sobhraj walked out of Tihar prison in 1997, the world he re-entered was different. But he was not. The years he had spent manipulating legal systems across borders had reinforced a dangerous conviction that intelligence, patience, and audacity could outmaneuver justice indefinitely. In France, he was no longer treated solely as a criminal, but as a controversial figure, part outlaw, part legend. Journalists sought interviews. Publishers offered contracts. Filmmakers circled. His escape from death had become a story detached from the deaths themselves. In Parisian cafes, Sobhraj spoke of his life with the detachment of an observer, recounting events as if they were abstract puzzles rather than human tragedies. He denied responsibility for murder while carefully preserving the mystique of a man who had beaten multiple governments at their own game. For him, the years of freedom were proof not of luck, but of mastery. It was in this atmosphere that he made the decision that stunned those who had followed his story most closely. In 2003, Charles Sobhraj traveled to Nepal. It was not a casual choice. Nepal was the site of murders committed in 1975, 2 Western travelers killed in Kathmandu under circumstances bearing Sobhraj's unmistakable signature. Unlike Thailand, Nepal imposed no statute of limitations on murder. The cases remained open. Evidence was preserved. Memories had not faded into legal irrelevance. Why would a man who had spent more than a decade orchestrating his own, continued imprisonment to avoid extradition voluntarily enter a country where time offered no protection? Observers proposed many explanations. Some pointed to arrogance, the belief that escaping justice repeatedly had transformed fortune into skill. Others suggested exhaustion, a subconscious desire for closure. But the simplest explanation may be the most accurate. Charles Sobhraj had never learned how to stop while he was ahead. Kathmandu in the early 2000s was no refuge for a man whose face was known internationally. Foreign journalists were active. Local police still remembered unresolved cases. And only weeks after his arrival, a reporter recognized him at a casino. Authorities moved quickly. There was no elaborate escape, no sedatives, no multi-layered deception. This time, there was only arrest. In 2004, a Nepali court convicted Charles Sobhraj of murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. Appeals followed and failed. Unlike previous legal battles, there were no procedural loopholes to exploit. Time could not dilute responsibility here. The years that followed were spent not as a manipulator of systems, but as an aging inmate in Kathmandu's central prison. His health declined. Heart disease emerged. His eyesight deteriorated. The privileges he once commanded in Tihar were absent. The system he had once bent now stood unmoved. In 2023, at the age of 78, Nepal released Charles Sobhraj on humanitarian grounds, citing advanced age and illness. He left prison in a wheelchair and returned to France not as a victor, but as a diminished figure whose legend had long outlived his power. The man who had turned prison into sanctuary, delay into strategy, and capture into survival, had finally encountered a boundary he could not manipulate. Luck had run out. Time, once his greatest ally, had turned against him. Charles Sobhraj believed intelligence could outrun consequence. And for years, it did. He avoided execution, manipulated systems, and turned captivity into shelter. But every victory led him back to the same place behind bars. Not because the system learned, but because time eventually stops favoring the clever. His life became proof of a darker truth: intelligence without conscience does not create freedom. It only postpones reckoning. And postponement, no matter how long, is never the same as escape. When the story of Charles Sobhraj finally comes to rest, what lingers is not awe at a clever escape, nor satisfaction that justice eventually caught up with a notorious criminal. What remains instead is an unsettling question, one that hovers between law, morality, and memory. What happens when intelligence is completely severed from conscience, and when systems designed to protect justice are turned into instruments of survival by those who understand them too well? Charles Sobhraj was not the most prolific killer in modern history. nor the only prisoner to ever escape custody. What set him apart was something far more disturbing. He did not seek freedom as an ideal. He understood, earlier than most, that freedom could be fatal. In a world that celebrates liberty as an absolute good, Sobhraj recognized its inverse, that in certain circumstances, captivity could be safer than release. His escape from Tihar was never an act of desperation. It was the culmination of years of observation, calculation, and restraint. Every sedative, every bribe, every relationship cultivated inside the prison served a single objective: time. Not redemption. Not transformation. Survival. Yet this is where the limits of his strategy become clear. Time can erase files, exhaust prosecutors, and allow statutes of limitation to expire. It can transform death sentences into irrelevant paperwork. But time cannot erase memory. It cannot undo lives lost, nor can it convert crime into innocence. Every legal victory Sobhraj achieved left behind families who would never receive answers, whose grief existed beyond the reach of procedural law. When he walked free in 1997, it was a technical triumph, but also the moment his trajectory narrowed. There were no longer multiple systems to play against one another. No great loopholes left to exploit. His public notoriety made concealment impossible. And when he entered Nepal, a jurisdiction where murder carried no expiration date, the long game ended. Kathmandu was not a chessboard. It was a courtroom. In the central prison there, Charles Sobhraj lived out the remainder of his power, not as a master strategist, but as an aging inmate. The tools that once allowed him to manipulate institutions were useless. Intelligence alone could not bend a system that refused to forget. His release in old age was not absolution, but administration, a recognition of mortality, not innocence. The legacy of Charles Sobhraj is therefore not one of genius, but of warning. His story exposes an uncomfortable truth: law is not morality. It is a structure necessary, rational, and vulnerable. When confronted by individuals willing to treat it as a game rather than a safeguard, even robust systems can be delayed, distorted, or neutralized. Not because they are weak, but because they are human. And yet, there is a boundary no strategy can cross. Sobhraj delayed death. He avoided execution. He outlasted warrants and deadlines. But he did not escape consequence. Every maneuver brought him back to confinement. Every victory led him once more behind bars. In the end, the life he preserved through calculation was one spent largely in cells. History is full of individuals who believed themselves smarter than the systems around them. Some succeeded briefly. But the story of Charles Sobhraj reminds us that intelligence without conscience does not lead to freedom. It leads only to postponement. And postponement is not escape. It is simply another way of waiting for the inevitable. That, perhaps, is the final verdict history delivers without the need for a judge, a sentence, or a courtroom. Long after Charles Sobhraj faded from headlines, his shadow remained. Not as a criminal myth but as a warning. He exposed how justice can be delayed, how procedure can be bent, and how time can betray victims more efficiently than violence. Laws were followed. Paperwork was complete. And yet, justice slipped quietly through the cracks. History remembers this not as brilliance, but as erosion. Because the most dangerous people are not always those who break the rules, but those who understand them well enough to let them fail. When the camera finally pulls away from Charles Sobhraj, his story does not dissolve into silence. It lingers not because of admiration, but because of discomfort. Long after the trials ended, long after the prison gates opened and closed for the final time, the implications of what he did continued to ripple outward, quietly unsettling the institutions once manipulated. Sobhraj did not merely exploit legal loopholes. He exposed them. In the years following his escape from Tihar, legal scholars in India and Southeast Asia revisited the case not as a criminal curiosity, but as a structural failure. How could one man, acting without violence and without political power, immobilize two national justice systems, simply by understanding procedure better than intention. The answer was not corruption alone, nor incompetence. It was complexity-layered systems designed for fairness, rendered fragile by their own caution. Tihar prison itself would never fully escape the shadow of 1986. Though reforms followed tighter controls, stricter oversight, reduced informal contact between inmates and guards, the damage was already done. The prison had become a symbol, not of cruelty, but of vulnerability. It stood as evidence that even the most fortified institutions can be undone, not by force, but by familiarity. In Thailand, the consequences were more painful. There was no courtroom reckoning. No final verdict spoken aloud. The expiration of the statute of limitations closed the cases quietly, administratively, without ceremony. For the families of the victims, justice did not fail loudly, it simply faded away. And in that silence, the distinction between legal resolution and moral resolution became impossible to ignore. Nepal's conviction of Charles Sobhraj offered a brief sense of balance, but even that came with ambiguity. His eventual release on humanitarian grounds reopened old wounds and reignited debates that had never truly settled. At what point does punishment end and mercy begin? And who gets to decide when the crimes are irreversible, but the criminal is no longer strong? By the time Sobhraj returned to France in his final years, he no longer represented danger. He represented residue, the remaining trace of a story that refused to resolve neatly. His life had become a case study taught in law schools, cited in policy discussions, and adapted in books and television series. But with each retelling, the risk grew that the spectacle would overshadow the substance. Because the true legacy of Charles Sobhraj is not cleverness. It is erosion. Erosion of trust in legal finality. Erosion of confidence in procedural justice. Erosion of the belief that time naturally favors the innocent. His story forces an uncomfortable reckoning. Systems are not defeated only by those who oppose them, but also by those who understand them too well and care too little about the human cost. Intelligence, when detached from accountability, becomes corrosive. And patience, when guided by indifference, can be as destructive as violence. In the end, Charles Sobhraj did not leave behind a blueprint to follow, but a warning to remember. Laws must evolve not only to punish crime, but to withstand manipulation. Justice must be protected not just from brutality, but from calculation. And history, unlike the law, has no statute of limitations. It remembers the victims. It remembers the silence. And it remembers that the most dangerous figures are not always those who break the rules, but those who bend them until they break everyone else.